Well, hello there and welcome to May's edition of First Friday. My name is Tom Ward, and as you can see, I am joined as always by Stuart Reynolds. And Stuart, it's funny because today we're talking about pastors, and I'm really glad that you've dressed up and got the dog collar on. I appreciate you.
It looks like that, doesn't it? But it's not really. I was just thinking about that 2 minutes before we started.
There you go. And I don't know if people can tell or not, this isn't your normal office or home space. Where are you currently?
Well, I'm in the United States at the minute, halfway through a 6 weeks preaching assignment. I'm in Tennessee in a place called Monterey. That'll not mean anything to probably most of the people watching and listening, but it's about 90 miles east of Nashville.
Amazing. And so has it been going well?
Thankfully, yeah, God's been very good to us. We've had some great meetings together. The 6 weeks I'm here, I think I'm preaching 40 meetings. I was counting up the last day, the other day there, and I've got a couple of days spare. But I'd rather be busy when I'm on my own. And just for the record, for the benefit of our listeners and viewers, I do want to thank Tom for his compassion, because I'm 6 hours behind Tom, and he did tell me he wanted me up at 4 to do this, but he had to do a John Wesley. But he's allowed me to do this just after 8 in the morning, which is what, 2:30 nearly. We're 8:30 now, so 6 hours. So that's really pastoral compassion, Tom, and that's what we're talking about today. So that I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Are you more of an early bird, or do you do your best work later on? I don't think we've ever talked about that before.
I love the early mornings when I'm working. Absolutely. And when I was in the pastorate, I would often be at my desk for 6 in the morning, because between 6 and 9, when most people are still in their beds or not getting around to getting in touch with you, it really is a good span of uninterrupted time. So I could get a lot of study done in that period, which really kind of gave me a good head start on the day. Because as a pastor, as you know, one of it goes with the territory of being a pastor, that your life is full of interruptions, and that's an observation. It's not a complaint. It's just a fact, that your life is constantly open to being interrupted.
Well, I'm glad that the time difference is the way it is then, and not the other way around, because I can get up when I have to, but I'm much more of a night owl than an early bird, I have to say. So as we've alluded to, we're talking about pastors today, ministers, and it started really with a quote that I heard in a podcast, and I can't, they didn't give a source for this quote, but basically one of the people on the podcast said 50% of church leaders currently would leave the profession, the ministry, if they could leave and get a job that basically paid at a similar level. If they could leave straight away, they would do that. And so I went searching and I couldn't find that specific statistic. If anyone knows, if you know where that's from, it would be really helpful for us if you could send us a link to info@gnba.net. What I found was Barna had done a study in 2021. They found that 30% of pastors want to quit, apparently. I did a little bit more searching and found that back in 2019, Lifeway Research found that 1,700 pastors quit every month. Now, it's fair to say that both Barna and Lifeway would be from a much more American standpoint. We are really grateful for those people who listen and view First Friday in America. So we know it's not completely redundant, but obviously both myself and Stuart are from a UK context and know many people do listen there. So I guess through that then, it's maybe the Lifeway research, maybe it'd be a little bit more than that. That was 2019, before most of COVID-19 and its impacts took over. And so this also then linked to an article that I saw on Christianity Today. Haven't been able to read the whole article because it's behind a paywall, which I find very frustrating. But anyway, the article was titled, "Our Pulpits Are Full of Empty Preachers," which I thought was a fascinating title. And basically the subheading said, "Tens of thousands want to quit, but haven't. And so that's what we thought about, whether it's 30%, whether it's a couple of thousand quitting every month, whether it's UK or US, there does seem to be an issue with many ministers at this time specifically wanting to step down from their role. And so we thought we'd talk about that. Stuart, as someone who was a minister for many years, how often did you want to quit?
Every Monday, probably. That was another statistic which I have known of for years, which I was unable to track down. But I think that any pastor listening and watching us today, when I say this, I think that they'll know in their gut this is pretty accurate. But statistics do suggest that most pastors resign on a Monday, or certainly go to resign. I felt like quitting a lot of times, and I think that anybody who has been in the ministry for even the least amount of time has felt that. That article that you referred to, the one behind the paywall, and I read the opening bit as well, because being a Scot, I'm not going to pay for it. But it then put me on one of the parts that we were able to read referred to the Great Resignation. And I thought, what an interesting phrase. And so I had a wee bit of research on that, and it's an idea that was proposed by Professor Anthony Clocks of Texas A&M University, that's saying that large numbers of people are going to leave their jobs after this pandemic really settles down and life begins to return, I guess, to a new normal. And there's plenty of material about the Great Resignation from a United Kingdom perspective, if you want to go and research that, anybody that's interested. My reaction to that in regard to the pastoral ministry is that I think that COVID really is a bit of an irrelevancy. I think that there has been a crisis of pastors leaving the ministry before COVID. Maybe for some, COVID accelerated it. One writer puts it like this regarding the last 2 years. Religious leaders have not only had to learn new ways of doing their jobs, delivering their sermons virtually, conducting online committee meetings, and substituting texting, Facebook, and Zoom for what used to be in-person, face-to-face encounters. They also had to decide repeatedly whether to encourage vaccinations, to close or reopen the church building, to enforce mask mandates, and navigate issues of race and politics. It's exhausting just thinking about the trials most clergy have had to face since COVID-19 hit. And I think that's all well said, but I think that it's too soon to tell that COVID has maybe just accelerated the process. It's certainly not created it. And my beginning point, my middle point, and my ending point for this really is Jeremiah chapter 20. And he says this in verses 7 through 10. O Lord, you deceived me, and I was deceived. You overpowered me and prevailed. I am ridiculed all day long. Everyone mocks me. Whenever I speak, I cry out, proclaiming violence and destruction. So the word of the Lord has brought me insult and reproach all day long. But if I say I will not mention him or speak any more in his name, his word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones. I am weary of holding it in. Indeed, I cannot. I hear many whispering, terror on every side. Report them. Let's report them. Oh, we could talk about that. All my enemies are waiting for me to slip, saying, perhaps he will be deceived. Then we will prevail over him and take our revenge on him. But the Lord is with me like a mighty warrior. So my persecutors will stumble and not prevail. They will fail and be thoroughly disgraced. Their dishonor will never be forgotten. I think most pastors feel like that on a regular basis. I have often felt on a Monday morning, particularly like quitting. And there are maybe some resignation letters that I have written and just put in my desk drawer, or I have just written in my mind. And what I would say is just two things at this point, Tom, before I throw it back to you. I would say to any pastor who does feel that way, whether it be a Monday or whatever day of the week, by all means, write that letter or the email but don't send it at that point. You know, file it away to see if this moment, as difficult as it is going to pass. And the second thing I would say is that we need to find a way of getting pastors, not one, it's a cyclical thing. You know, we don't just feel like quitting once. I think it's a recurring feeling and experience for a lot of pastors. We have to find a way of getting pastors in those places from verse 7 of Jeremiah 20 through to verse 11, knowing that God is with me. And because of that, I'm able to go on. And, you know, we expect our pastors to be trained for ministry in how to look after our congregations. But who instructs our congregations as to how they should look after pastors?
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely key point. I get a sense from knowing various pastors that there is a sense of not always being appreciated in the role that you're doing. There is a kind of expectation that you'd be above reproach, which is biblical. There's an expectation that you would know all the answers, which I don't think is biblical. There's an expectation that you would do most, if not all of the work, which I don't think is biblical either. If you think of Ephesians chapter 4, where it says, Paul says, and he has given apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry. So the role of a pastor, as far as I can see, is to preach God's word and is to equip the saints, the brothers and sisters in Christ, to do the majority of the work. And so I'm not saying that pastors don't need to do stuff, they clearly do, but I think sometimes there's an expectation that they will do the majority of the work and people will come and simply consume. And then I think one of the things, and I agree with you, that I don't think COVID kind of began any pastors' struggles. I think it's likely that there would already be difficulties and frustrations that were kind of just exacerbated by the lockdowns and the impact on church. But I do think one of the hardships that probably came even more with that was trying to be the arbitrator, trying to be the person who resolved the conflicts amongst the congregations in terms of when we return to meeting in person, do we wear masks, do we not? Do we sing or not? Can we have teas and coffees afterwards? And I've heard from a few pastors about how that's caused huge issues in the church. So if you're already feeling burnt out, you're already feeling frustrated, and then you have to be the person that tries to reconcile people in church who have been very wounded or hurt or upset about the way that certain people have approached the lockdown. So I think you're absolutely right. I've been an elder in 2 churches. I've never been the lead pastor or a minister, church leader, but I've seen from being an elder, but also knowing other ministers, the pressure that you feel. And I think that in itself, I think personally it's unhealthy, really. I think it's inevitable, but fairly unhealthy to have one person that is kind of overseeing the church. That's why we have elders, and I'm not against there being the first among equals, but I do think there is a danger of your one person at the top. That is such pressure to face. And if the book ultimately stops with you on every decision ultimately, then the pressure that you feel must be huge. And I think so if the pressure comes along with not feeling appreciated, not feeling like people are for you or are getting behind you or just encouraging you in what you're doing, that must be really difficult. I often think when I visit churches to preach, I get a bit of the kind of what is it, those kind of when you're the new preacher, it's a little bit of a honeymoon period, isn't it? I get to turn up, preach for the first time, and then sometimes are quite encouraged by people's response. And I know I've talked to pastors before who preached at the same church for 10, 15 years, and people no longer really give those encouragements because they've seen you preach hundreds of times. And it's not that your preaching is worse. In fact, I'd imagine almost 99 times out of 100, it's much better. The congregation, your preaching will have developed exponentially, but people just get used to it, don't they? They get used to you preaching, they get used to you being there, they get used to you answering the questions, they get used to you answering the phone. And so I guess if you're watching or listening to this today, an encouragement would be to encourage your pastor, encourage your minister, and let him know how much you have appreciated. You don't want to wait until the person's left or till their funeral to tell them how much you appreciated their ministry.
Yes, and I mean, I'm experiencing that at the minute, again, in what I'm involved in over here. Having been a pastor for all those years, and now I'm itinerant, and so I'm going around, and it happens, particularly because I'm my assignment at the moment is to preach revival services, and you're calling people to a point of decision and renewal, and I'm aware that somebody like me comes in and preaches, and there may even be not just verbal appreciation on a one-to-one after the service, but there might be people responding, coming forward to pray and whatnot. And I think that can be make the host pastor, the local pastor concerned, feel a wee bit insecure if he's not secure. And here's this guy comes in to preach 2 or 3 meetings or whatever, and he gets this great spot. The exact thing that you've said. But I don't think, Tom, with you being itinerant the same as me, in that sense, being in different churches, I don't think that people in our position really would be foolish enough to think, well, look at what we've done, or God, we understand. And when I'm visiting a church that has a pastor, I'm always careful to commend the pastor publicly and to affirm him publicly. And when I'm talking about what's happening in the services, I'm always careful to say that this is part of a process. Remember in the Corinthian church, some follow Apollos, some follow Peter, and all the rest of it, and at the end of the day, the Apostle Paul has said, who are any of these guys? One guy plants, the other guy waters, but it's God who makes it grow. And I do think, and this might be a wee bit tough to say, that pastors have really got to get to a place where they really understand that, and they don't feel insecure about it, and they don't feel offended by it. One of the things that you said a moment ago, and you talked about, the buck stopping with the pastor, and that's absolutely correct, that observation. And in many respects, he is the under shepherd, and so it has to stop with somebody in that regard. But I do think, Tom, in fairness, having experienced what I have and observed what I've had over the years as a pastor, that pastors have got to help themselves. I find the most difficult group that I ever have to preach to are other pastors. Now, in many senses, it should really be the opposite, because we're all in the same boat, and we know what it means to stand in front of people and open God's book. When I was a pastor, every month, the denomination that I served with, we had what we called, for our denomination, not necessarily talking about churches together in any local area where it's many denominations, but for other denominational pastors, mine was the Church of the Nazarene, and we had every month what was called zone fraternals, and the idea was that every month pastors in a locality would come together for the purposes of encouragement, and they might just have a sharing time. Somebody might present a paper on something, then they would pray and maybe have some tea and then go home. There were some pastors who never came to that. Did I get to everyone? No, because sometimes things do come up which you can't avoid. But some pastors used to joke and say, "Oh, I'll not be able to make that next month. I've got a funeral," and they were being funny, but what they were really saying is that they had no intention of coming. Now, in the secular workplace, if your manager calls a team meeting, you have to go. Doesn't matter how busy you are, doesn't matter how inconvenient it is, you have to go. I think that there should be that kind of expectation, that the pastors, we are obligated to each other. You know, we are not loose cannons. We need each other. And then, of course, the second hurdle is not only getting pastors together, is in what they do when they are together. You know, Jim Cymbala talks about the trinity of conversation between pastors. And I've had it myself loads of times. ABC, attendance, buildings, and cash. You know, what does it matter what the attendance is? What does it matter what the state of the building is? What does it matter really, how much money the church is taking in tithes and offerings? But it's almost like a sense of competition. You know, when I've been at other events, like say a pastor's lunch with sponsored by Christian Institute, and I'm introducing myself to pastors, and they'll say, how many do you have at your church? That's the first question. And I'm thinking, why? You know, and I always like to go, in my mind, I'm thinking, I'll maybe say 2,500, you know what I mean, see what that does, you know, but I just don't understand. I think that we could do a lot to help ourselves. I've been a pastor, I still am a pastor at heart. I want to be a great champion of pastors, and I believe that I am, but I'm not also an idiot or fooled when it comes to pastors, that sometimes, even a lot of the times, we could take steps to help ourselves.
Interesting. Yeah. And in terms of practically, so you're saying one thing would be to be involved in, like, in a sense, forcing yourself to meet up with other ministers, because actually when you get there, you're going to be more encouraged. You know, I mean, you've been there like I have, you know, you've got a meeting coming up and you don't particularly want to go, or even kind of an event at church, and then you actually go, and once you're there, you're really encouraged to do it. But is there any other practical ways you're thinking that you can, as a minister, should be caring for your own soul, really, and making sure that you're doing everything you can to be in a good spiritual place?
Yeah, well, we've touched on this previously when we've talked about preaching. You know, that the danger of pastoral ministry is that it can all become what is called perfunctory, the wrong kind of professionalism. You know, if the Bible just becomes the tool of my trade, whereby I'm only coming to the Bible to get a sermon for Sunday, I'm in trouble. You know, I have to come to the scriptures to feed my own soul, not to get a sermon for next Sunday. And that really is a discipline, Tom. And you have to make time. You know, I think I talked earlier about you make me maybe pull a John Wesley to get up early. But if that is what it takes to get before God on your own, that's what you have to do. I think primarily, you know, we encourage our congregations to look after their own souls and to feed their own souls. We've got to do that. And it's just, to me, that's a matter of survival. And so I think that we've got to be in the daily place. I mean, I've heard some horrendous statistics about pastors being surveyed on how much they pray in a week. Personally. And sometimes it's less than 10 minutes in a week. Now, I appreciate the honesty of the pastors who've been involved in those surveys, but I think that reveals something very, very serious. And so, you know, there are steps that we can take. And I think the first, I mean, what is it that Paul said to Timothy? You know, we've talked about this in regard to preaching again, but 1 Timothy 4:16, watch your life and doctrine closely. Watch your life and doctrine. Persevere in them, because if you do, you will save both yourself and your hearers. And then is it 1 Corinthians 9 where Paul talks about I beat my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself might not be disqualified for the prize. We have to look to our own souls. That is not being selfish. You know, I cannot be the best for my wife or my children, not to mention the congregation I serve, if I am not in a right way before God.
Yeah. And I think it's important that we recognize that it's a calling. And if it's a calling from God, then in those harder times, those more difficult times, you can then look back and realize that ultimately this is what God called you to do. What I found fascinating about the Christianity Today article was, as I say, I read just a chunk of it, and it said this church had taken on a pastor who, I think it was about 11 months later, not even a year later, had realized that this wasn't for him and he was going to go and do another profession. And I understand the idea, and I think I called it a profession even earlier. But there is something in the fact that this isn't a job, you know, that you I could be a pastor for a few years and then I can go and work something else. I'm not saying that once you're a minister, you're always a minister, but I do think if it's a calling, then it's something that you surely can't give up just that simply. You know, I was thinking recently of Colossians. There's this fascinating little line at the end of chapter 4 when Paul is going through his kind of commendations. He's giving greetings from various people. And then just in verse 17, he says, and say to Archippus, see that you fulfill the ministry that you have received in the Lord. And what's interesting about it is, firstly, Archippus has made it into the letter, and it doesn't come with a rebuke, but at the same time, it doesn't come with it's not like he says, Archippus is a dear and faithful brother, like he does often with others. He just kind of, it seems like he's using this as an opportunity to zero in and say, Archippus, you need to fulfill the ministry that you've received in the Lord. So the ministry that you've been given is from God. This is a calling upon your life. And I don't know where Archippus was at. I'd love to know and what he was thinking when this letter is read and suddenly he receives this kind of encouragement to remember you've been called to this. You know, it's a good thing to want to be a minister. I think it's what it says, you know, in 1 Timothy chapter 3, it says that anyone who desires to be an overseer or an elder or a bishop or a minister desires a noble task. I think different translations say good, excellent. You know, it's a good thing. You know, if you were to meet up with a young guy and he's 18, 19 years old and say, I'd love to be a pastor, I'd love to be a minister, I think there's something really good and healthy in that you would long for it. And I think there is a sense that all of us, whoever we are in church, really should be aspiring to the qualifications. I think there are standards that ultimately all of us should aim for. But saying that, not everybody who wants to be a pastor should be. And I remember a friend of mine saying to me years ago, because you know Stuart personally, I've kind of ummed and ahed back and forth about this. Would I ever lead a church? And often it comes down to the fact is I am not sure yet whether that is a calling. I could choose to do it, but I want to make sure it's got to be something where, you know what I mean, that this has the backing of the Lord. Otherwise, I will not be able to survive. I know I won't be able to do it unless it is what God's calling me to do it. But a friend of mine said, he's a pastor of a church and remains a pastor, said, Tom, if you can do anything else, do that. And I remember at the time feeling quite discouraged and thinking, but actually, as I've reflected on it, I think the fact is for him, he can't do anything else because God's called him to do it. But for others who are like, I mean, could I do this for a few years, or, you know, maybe this is a stepping stone to something else. It is a wonderful calling. And you've said time and time again, Stuart, to me that it's the best job that you could ever have.
Believe that.
But it is also very difficult. It is a lot of pressure. You've got to be able to work on your own a lot and be self-motivated. You've also got to be confident enough to be able to stand up and communicate in front of people. You've got to be a good peacemaker, but you've also got to be able to lead and be strong. You've got to be exemplary in the way that you lead your family. And so there are, yeah, so all that together, I think it's got to be a calling. Otherwise, I can understand why most people would quit.
Yes, I mean, what your friend said, and Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones said, a man should only enter the Christian ministry if he cannot stay out of it. And we have lost that sense of calling, Tom. You know, the old cliche about ministry, you know, the pastor works one day a week, you know. And let's be honest, some pastors are lazy, particularly in this day and age where you can download almost pre-prepared sermons in their entirety. I heard Charles Swindoll just last week talk about the time years ago in the early days of Insight for Living, and one particular week they had some problem and couldn't get, well, it was, this is how long ago it was, cassettes out to their mailing list. And this panicking pastor phoned up the office and said, well, where's the tape? Where's the tape? And they said, we've had some problems. It's not going to arrive this week. He says, well, I'm not going to preach on Sunday. and Swindoll rightly said that that's plagiarism. You know, but that's what some pastors do. And you know, the pastoral ministry, and there are pastors who do behave this way. The pastoral ministry is not a vacation. It is a vocation. It is a calling. And you know, I've been so gripped these last years with the accounts of First Kings and Chronicles, when the Northern Kingdom splits, if you remember, after David dies and after Solomon dies, and then Rehoboam, his son, takes over, and they have a chance to unite the kingdom under the rebel king coming into alliance with Jeroboam. And of course, Rehoboam goes with the advice of the younger folk. That's not the point I'm making, but the kingdom split. And in order to stop people from the northern kingdom going to Jerusalem to worship, Jeroboam, son of Nebat, erected 2 golden calves in Bethel, and I think it was Dan is the other one, to stop them going from Jerusalem. But then it says this: he let anybody who wanted to become a priest. And it says that more than once. And even after Jeroboam, son of Nebat, had died and was off the scene, if you continue reading the accounts of Kings and Chronicles, it says about successive kings, and he followed in the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat. What was that sin? He let anybody who wanted to become a priest. Of course, it was just the Levites in the Old Testament who had the calling to be priests. I think that we're in a similar situation today. I think that it is coupled with desperation, the pastoral crisis in terms of vacancies that we have in our pulpits, and so anybody who's breathing and is available gets thrown into the pulpit. And I think there's a sense of novelty. Oh, that I think I could do that, and I don't think that is good enough. And I think that we need to test a call. But you know, Paul, the Apostle Paul, what did he say in Romans 1:1? He talks about being a bond servant. Bond servant. That was a category of slave who had completely signed away all his rights to live for his master. And so we have this idea of calling. And then what does Paul say in more than one of his letters? Called to be an apostle. Now, we're not apostles, we understand that. But we are no less called as ministers, as pastors, to the vocation that we are. And I testify that is what has kept me. This idea, sometimes the ministry for me has been like a ball and chain. That's like, you know, I'm tied to it because I'm called. Yes, I could walk away, but I couldn't do anything else. Certainly couldn't do it with satisfaction and in any stretch of capability, that the way that God has enabled me to do ministry, because He's called me. And I think that is the defining issue in all of this. The fact that we are called of God, and at the end of the day, it really is, to coin a phrase, an audience of one, pleasing God. And God understands that. I know some pastors, we have to get beyond the issue of numbers. We've talked about Sunday evening services, but it's been well said. The reason a lot of churches don't have Sunday evening services, Tom, is the pastor's ego. Because a pastor does not want to preach to a small crowd. And I know pastors and preachers who will not go to particular churches because, to preach, because they're below a certain number. Where is that reflective of a bond slave, of somebody who's called? People need feeding, whether there's 5 of them, whether there's 500 of them. And it's getting back to this issue of we're called. And it's the calling, I think, that keeps us. And it's the calling that gets us from the place of despair, Jeremiah 20 and verse 7, through that difficult time when we want to quit. The fact that we are called, and that God will keep us. And there's been times that I have felt like quitting and walking away. It's the last thing I wanted to do. But God has never quit on me. Never. And of course, the old phrase, if God calls you to be a missionary, don't stoop to be a king. Whatever God has called us to do, but pastoral ministry is a calling. And I think a test of that call is that if you can do anything else and be settled in it, go and do that anything else. But I know that I couldn't.
What I think was interesting about the Christianity Today article was, obviously, they said our pulpits are full of empty preachers. I think they've obviously concluded then that of the many thousands of people who thought that they would step down, many have chosen to stay. But obviously that doesn't mean it's automatically resolved the issues that they've had. And so that could impact then their ministry, how they're preaching, how they're looking for others out.
Did it say, Tom? I didn't get a chance to read the article. Did the article say why they had chosen to stay on?
It doesn't. As I say, I was similar to you, because I've signed up to Christianity Today in the past. I got maybe a page more than you, but still it didn't get into the heart of it. But I've heard things when I heard that in the podcast about 50% of pastors stepping down, that if they could find somewhere else that paid them the same amount. And I've always thought that, particularly in the UK, preachers are rarely paid, at least of the ones I would know, would rarely be paid a high rate. And so it wouldn't be massively hard to find something else to do, maybe, in terms of job wise. I don't know. But as you look back over your years then, do you, as a pastor, do you think that you were adequately told what the challenges were going to be from others in church, but also maybe in terms of Bible college as well? Was a picture fairly painted of what it would be like?
Well, yes and no. I mean, at that, when you're young, I started training for the ministry when I was 21, and I entered my first pastorate after graduating when I was 25. And at that age, we're going to change the world.
Yeah, I was thinking as you said that when you do, when you're engaged and you do marriage prep and you're told about how hard things are going to get, and it's not always going to be this rosy, and you're just looking at your fiance like, that's not going to be us. The same.
What I would say is, the college that you should never bite the hand that feeds you. And at the time, the college that I trained at was excellent, because it wasn't training academics. for the main part, it was training pastors. And certainly the further you go back in the history of that particular Bible college, most of the faculty would either be serving pastors or professors who had served as pastors or missionaries. You know, there's an old phrase, those who can do, those who can't teach. And towards the end of my time there, the tide was beginning to turn. I'm nothing against academics. And I believe I graduated before it really did dip in the establishment where I trained at. And that was for a lot of reasons. I believe that I was well equipped for maintaining a long-term preaching ministry. In my first year, 9 months into my first year, my father he was only 49, was diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor. That was in the March, and he was in heaven by Christmas. I came home at Easter because I felt college was in Manchester. I lived in Glasgow. I felt I needed to be with my family. My district superintendent put me in to pastor a church for 9 months. And that was a great experience. And the church wanted me to stay. I'm 21 years old, Tom. The church wanted me to stay. The district superintendent wanted me to stay. I wanted to stay because we just think we know it all and can do it, don't we? And so they all wanted me to stay. The college, and particularly the principal, his name is Herbert McGonigal, a great man. He and the college wanted me back. And so, of course, he was me going back down to Manchester. And I was just going to tell him, I am not coming back. And I went into his office and he said, Stuart, sit down. Because I had such respect for this man, still do. And he folded his hands on the desk, didn't raise his voice. And he said, Stuart, he said, I expect to see you in September when the new academic year begins. And I just went, okay. And I did. If I hadn't done that, I wouldn't be a preacher or a pastor today.
Interesting.
College gave me the tools for ministry. So it was a great preparation. And although I'm disappointed the way it is now, when I was there, I was well trained, and I look back on those years with appreciation, the people who spoke into my lives. Probably the best part of college was the last term, which was a short term in our final year, which was 6 weeks. We did a recent Sermonize podcast, and I talked about the pastor who taught us homiletics, you know, the mechanics of preaching, who I still meet with. He's 91, Reverend Les Evans. He was the Nazarene's Prince of Preachers, as far as I'm concerned. And he used to, what he did for that last short term, those who were going into the pastoral ministry, and we were at the end of our study course, we met with him on a Wednesday afternoon for a whole afternoon for about 6 weeks, and maybe only 4 or 5 of us. And during that time, he said, there's no test to this. He says, you pass if you turn up. So there's no, you know, he says that. He says, but everything that's said stays in this room. And he talked about, he gave us some, you know, like, here's how to do a funeral, here's how to do a wedding, you know, the
nuts and bolts, yeah.
Yes. But then he also said, you can ask me absolutely anything. He'd been a pastor for 40 odd years by this time. He says, you can ask me absolutely anything about pastoral ministry, and I will tell you the truth. And so, you know, I would say that was really, really helpful. And also, as I said on that Sermonized podcast, God has always given me the awareness, and that's why I'm having such a great time here outside of the services. I'm catching up with a lot of mentors here. I'm being around real men of God who have done it all. and they're in their late 70s and 80s, and they're still going. And this awareness that I need to be around older men to learn from them and just be in their presence. And so I hope that answers the question. Yes and no. You don't really know until you get into the trenches. But again, you need to build into your life good disciplines, Bible reading and all the rest of it. But also let your ego die in the sense of pride and surround yourself with men who are godly, who have done it. Allow them to speak into your lives, not just to confirm you, but to correct you, and who are better people than you. And we've got to find these guys, and I certainly have, and I would commend that for pastors to do, because they will support you through it and walk you through it. And many pastors ultimately quit, Tom, just because, as you said earlier, they just feel isolated.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And you mentioned sermonize there, and I was just thinking, for anyone who is watching or listening and is maybe going through a season of difficulty, not all difficult seasons are depression, obviously, but there's a specific episode with a pastor called Stephen Neal, who is in Greater Manchester, leads a church around here, but has suffered with depression for the entire time that he's been a minister, and found that really helpful. And so if you're someone that is just feel like there's a kind of a dark cloud over your life at the moment, you could have a listen to that. It's on our website, gnba.net. But also in that podcast, there's a link. He mentions a book that he was involved in writing. I think, if I remember rightly, it was called Thorn in the Side, or Thorn in the Flesh, about, I think it's multiple chapters to do with pastors who have struggled with depression. So that's something definitely to look at. But this has all been really helpful, Stuart. And I wonder if there might be some kind of closing comments you wanted to bring to this. As I say, I just think we've kind of really been helped by what you've said. You've obviously been there yourself and still continue to serve. And so where would you like to finish it? Give us some kind of concluding thoughts, if you would.
Yes, and you don't know I'm going to do this, and I don't have a second thought about one of the things I'm going to do. But I wrote a book called The Broken Pastor, and if you can see that I have not modelled for the cover. I just have to say that that was Tom that did. So thank you, Tom, for doing that. But
it really wasn't me. Just in case anyone was slightly
so strong. I want to read just some paragraphs from one of the chapters in the book, and it's called Monday Morning Letters, because going back to this, most pastors feel like quitting on a Monday. And if you'd let me just read an excerpt from it, I think it'll tie things up. But what I want to do, Tom, for the next month, so that's between May's first Friday and June's first Friday, if people will give a donation to Good News Broadcasting and will cover the postage, they can have this book.
Okay? Amazing. You didn't check with me, because I was just about to say, if you want to, so obviously I know you've self-published this and into it, but
I am committed to pastors, and particularly if there are pastors watching and listening to this, I would really counsel you to get it. And anybody who's watching who knows a pastor, or any church leaders, deacons and elders who are watching who are not pastors, you need to get a book like this, not because I wrote it, but because of the contents within it. And so for the next month, if you give any donation to Good News Broadcasting, and you send in just cover for the postage, and Tom will give me the details and get this book to you. But I want to just, is it all right if I just read a bit? Because, okay, it says this, or I say this, although there is no one factor that does it, there is a final one, the proverbial last straw, talking about quitting. And it seems to push us too far and we cross a line. We cannot go on. On its own, Mrs. Parker's constant whinging about the length of the sermon and the choice of hymns can be coped with. On its own, Mr. Barrett's barred comments can be taken in our stride. On its own, the church spinster Miss Murray and her always being a martyr to the cause when there's any work needing to be done so as to take away from the good she does and spoil a team effort from everyone else can be overcome. On its own, the predictable pedantic correction shouted out from the congregation during the announcements or pointed out to the pastor about a misprint in the newsletter can be coped with. On its own, the brashness of Mr. Thompson, who always has to say something despite his rarely having something to say, can be brushed off. On its own, the easy come, easy go attitude of Mr. and Mrs. Pewwarmer and family, who you never see from one Sunday to the next, never caring because they never have a care, is a reality you have long since accepted you cannot change. On its own, the loud pianist who performs more than he accompanies is seen as better than having no pianist at all, and so is accommodated, even humoured. How much of the above live in your congregation? But here's the point. On its own, on its own, on its own. It's never on its own. And I talk about the cumulative effect of things. But then I have a wee section to conclude the chapter that says this. Before you write that letter, consider you're in good company. Not only do you stand shoulder to shoulder with God's faithful servant Jeremiah, but you stand by the side of God's beloved Son, Jesus Christ. What else could I do anyway? There's a section on that. It's still the best job in the world. And then let me just finish this. What we must seek to remember, because we must come to ultimately understand it, is that our reaching for the Monday morning letter does not diminish or deny the genuineness of our call to service and continuance in ministry. It affirms it. To want to write the Monday morning letter on any day is never the final and truthful word on us and our faithfulness, but what we do with it will be. To put it back in the drawer even for another time, but going on today, no matter what we're facing, despite how we may or may not be feeling, is what it means to be called of God and kept by God, as we remain for God in faithfulness, trust, humility, and even necessity. We too must surely find it as Jeremiah did when he laid aside his Monday morning letter because of the divine necessity that had so marked out his life. And so I would commend that to people, not because I wrote it, but just because it needs to be written. And maybe you can just give further details of that, Tom, just to remind people of what they need to do.
Absolutely,
in terms of contacting.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And yeah, I can thoroughly recommend it as well. So if people would just, if you send an email to info@gnba.net, and you could just mention First Friday either in the subject heading, or just make sure you mention that you've watched or listened to it, and we will get that out to you as soon as possible. And I do think it may be that you are aware of someone else. We are aware that pastors watch and listen, but also there are lots who aren't in full-time ministry, but it may be that you could encourage your pastor with it. Again, I'm happy for that to be slightly wider as well, that if you feel it could bless somebody else, we would very much like to do that for you. Thanks so much for being with us, and I feel like there's always more to say. There was just something on a more personal note I wanted to mention, similar to the calling that I talked about before. When I first stepped down from being an elder from a church I was involved in, I said to myself that I will never be involved in church leadership again. It had been quite a difficult season, quite a hard time in life. And I remember going away to the hills over in Glossop and went for a walk, took my Bible with me. And this is going to sound very, more charismatic maybe than I am, but I was walking, praying that God would speak to me in the kind of really difficult time and season that I was in. Long and short of it, I was reading Psalm 1 and felt like there was a link there and to a passage in Jeremiah that I'd read, found Jeremiah 17, read along there to verse 16. and felt like the Lord really impressed this verse on me. And it's the most random verse in a fairly neglected book in the Old Testament. Although Stuart mentioned Jeremiah, I don't know many people that often talk about it apart from Jeremiah 29:11. But anyway, Jeremiah 17:16, as I was reading along the passage, it just says this: I've not run away from being your shepherd. And I felt like in that moment, the Lord spoke very powerfully to me that at that time I was clearly running away and that God still had more for me. It wasn't in that church that I was in, but it ultimately led to me becoming an elder in the church that I'm currently part of. And I wouldn't have done that. I had decided in my mind that it wasn't worth the hassle. It was, just very difficult. But actually, the reason I say that is that for anyone who is struggling or finding it hard at this time, cry out to God and pray to God that he would reconfirm that call. And I don't doubt there are some people that it is a time to stop. You know, there are some people that maybe God has said that is for a season, or maybe some people never should have been pastors. That's a different discussion for another time. But if God wants you where you are, I do believe that he will encourage you and equip you in that, not just in talking to others, as Stuart said, but also, in God reaffirming that for you. And so on the top of a little hill on a wet day in Glossop, the Lord spoke to me from the most random verse in Jeremiah, and I still hold it very dear as a verse that I believe the Lord reconfirmed to me. I was running away from leadership because I'd had enough, and God called me back to it. And I really appreciate that God is a God who speaks. He is the God who sees. He is the God who hears. He knows what you're going through. And so cry out to him, I think, is the best advice. Thank you so much for being with us. We will be back, Lord willing, next month. As always, we love to hear your comments, or if you have a question that you would like us to answer. I know I've already given the contact detail, but do send an email to info@gnba.net. And I'm sure that you will, with me, continue to pray for Stuart as he continues these days of real important ministry in America. Do pray for him and join us back if you can next month. Goodbye and God bless.